Mentioning those 4 goals, I've put the goals in this box below me here, the Year of Youth aims or the goals, just to remind ourselves of what we're trying to achieve during this year. So prayerfully discern the Australian Catholic Bishop's vision for ministry with young people anointed and sent, authentic and personal engagement by church leaders in the challenges and successes in young people's lives, acknowledge the Holy Spirit at work in the lives of young people and young people acting upon the Holy Spirit in the life of the church. And I can't see the bottom one on my screen, but hopefully you guys can. Uphold the dignity of young people, ensuring a safe environment from physical, emotional, and spiritual harm. So I wanted to highlight those, one, because, hey, if we're doing all of that, we're doing a pretty good job by the end of this year. But also, obviously, our theme today about unpacking the Royal Commission really relates to that 4th goal of the Year of Youth, upholding the dignity of young people, ensuring a safe environment from physical, emotional, and spiritual harm. So that's what we're looking at today. So without wanting to keep you any longer from the main event, I would like to introduce Sheree Limbrick, who is the CEO of Catholic Professional Standards Ltd. She is the inaugural CEO and is relatively new to the position. And I just wanted to say before I hand over as well that as a reminder that in that Q&A box, if you think of any questions at all whilst during Sheree's presentation, you might like to pop that in the box. We will have an opportunity later on in this webinar to ask Sheree questions, but if you pop them in while you're thinking of them, we can make sure that we pass them on and they get answered during that session. So be throwing them in as you're thinking of them. But otherwise, I'm going to pass over to you, Sheree.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Rachel. Sorry. I was just saying this is my 2nd ever webinar, and I was proud of how well I was doing, and then I left my microphone muted, but never mind. So thanks, everyone, for joining us this evening. I'm going to spend a little bit of time, hopefully, helping you understand a little bit more about the role of Catholic Professional Standards, which is a new company for the Catholic Church in Australia, and also spend a little bit of time looking at some of the specific recommendations coming out of the Royal Commission. So let's get started. So a little bit about Catholic Professional Standards. We're a company, as I said, set up by the Bishops' Conference and Catholic Religious Australia, but we are set up as an independent company. The owners, if you like, of the company are those 2 groups, the Bishops' Conference and Catholic Religious Australia. The 4 people that we report to then, essentially, in terms of the board, who we liaise with, are Archbishop Coleridge from Brisbane and Bishop Wright from Maitland, Newcastle, and Sister Ruth Jurek, who's the President of Catholic Religious Australia, and Father Tom McDonough, who is the Vice President of Catholic Religious Australia. So if there are any issues that the board need to refer to the owners of the company structurally, then they're the 4 people. We don't have to go back and necessarily talk to all the bishops or all the religious. We have representatives that the board deal with. In terms of the board, there are 7 members on the board, and they are all pretty high-powered independent thinkers and very experienced in their fields of endeavour. So Patricia Faulkner, Jeff Judicher, Jeff is our chairman, and Patricia is Deputy Chair, and Dr. Robin Miller. All 3 of those are from Victoria. We then have Michael Lavache and John Watkins, who are from New South Wales, and Michael originally from Queensland, but now resident in Sydney. And Dr. Ruth Sheen is from Western Australia, from Perth, and Dr. Kerry Chute is from Brisbane. So we have very strong national coverage on the board. And in terms of their skills and backgrounds, I won't go into the details of them all specifically, but the areas that they cover include quite detailed experience in child protection, in health, social services, education, the law, governance of organisations, culture change in organisations, and also 2 board members are currently still also involved in other sorts of regulation. So the idea of setting standards and monitoring performance in organisations. So we've got quite a depth of experience in the board, which is fantastic. I'm not sure if I mentioned before, but the notion of the company being functionally independent. So obviously the bishops and religious own the company, so we're not structurally independent. We wouldn't exist if they didn't set us up and fund us at this point. But in terms of functional independence, Neville Owen, who's the chair of the Truth, Justice and Healing Council, gave evidence to the Royal Commission in February last year, case study 50, and talked with the commissioners about the notion of functional independence. So really the idea of having the organisation set up with an independent board, so no clergy and religious on the board, having that board very much skill-based, so as I mentioned, the breadth of skills on the board earlier, and basically functionally they run the organisation day to day, and we refer very, very few things back to the owners of the company. And so that's important to note, that we do function day to day, separate from the hierarchy of the church. I commenced as CEO in July last year, so I've been in my role for about 8 months. And we now, or in the next week or so, will have about 7 staff, including myself. So we have a director of safeguarding and a director of compliance and a training manager and a couple of other staff supporting the team. So we're a pretty small team, and we're based principally in Melbourne, but we're doing quite a lot of travel around the country. And that's mainly because our constitution, our charter, says we have coverage of all activities of the Catholic Church in Australia. So we are definitely getting ourselves around and about, meeting lots of dioceses and congregations, and visiting schools and parishes and all sorts of places. Our initial focus while we're getting started is working with dioceses under the Bishops' Conference, including the eparchies, the Eastern Rite and the Ordinariates, and also members of religious congregations under Catholic Religious Australia. But that's not to say that we're not also interested in engaging, and we are engaging actually, with other groups. So the public juridic persons who oversee some of the health, education and social services that might have previously been run by some of the principally larger congregations. So there's Mary Aikenhead Ministries, which is the Sisters of Charity, PJP, and Dominican Education Australia, which is obviously the Dominican Sisters schools, Edmund Rice Education and others. And also other groups like St Vincent de Paul and various other groups. So we are reaching out to sort of talk to as many groups as we can. Just a little bit about what we've, a bit more about the scope and the charter of our work. The next couple of slides come directly from the Constitution of the company, which really sets us up for our mission, if you like, and the purpose. So ultimately, the mission of the organisation is to promote the dignity and welfare of everyone who comes in contact with any Catholic Church activity across Australia, but obviously with a particular focus on children and vulnerable people. Through our establishment really, and part of the purpose really, is to ensure that everyone who does engage with the Catholic Church, and as I said, with anything, whether it's walking through the doors of a Catholic hospital or children and families who are being educated in Catholic schools, obviously people in our parishes, young people who go on, social justice camps or immersions or any sorts of camps or activity, youth ministry, that really we're here to ensure that everyone who comes in contact with any part of the church is treated with respect, professionalism, and in accordance with the values of the gospel. And really how we intend to do that in terms of the purpose is this notion of setting these standards that everyone then needs to adhere to, and then being able to audit, understand how people are performing, and then report against, publicly report the findings of each of those audits. And I'll come back on and touch on that a little bit later. When there was evidence in case study 50 in February last year to the Royal Commission, Archbishop Coleridge and the commissioners engaged in a conversation with him about culture change and what did culture change look like for the church and what were they expecting really CPSL to be able to assist with that culture change. So Archbishop Coleridge talked about 4 key elements of changing culture in the Australian Church. So I'll do a little bit of off the top of my head, but I'll also quote from him so I don't make up what he said. But his 4 elements started with awareness, and that was really about really informing everyone in the church, from bishops, congregational leaders, agency leaders, leaders of youth ministry, leaders of agencies, but also families, parishioners, students, basically raising awareness of the whole Catholic community about what is child protection and how do we go about it, and how do we go about creating an institution that is safe, made up of lots and lots of individuals, obviously. So awareness was his first element. His second element was around accountability, and really he acknowledged here the failures of the leadership of the Catholic Church in the past in Australia, the bishops and religious leaders, who, when obviously through the Royal Commission we heard time and time again of cases where things weren't right, where crimes were being committed, and our leaders let us down and let the victims and survivors down, the children of those days down, by not acting swiftly, by not understanding, by, basically making some bad decisions. So he really talked about cultural change being about also making sure that those bishops and leaders actually are held accountable for their actions, and that they're not a law unto themselves. They were his words, the law unto themselves. His third element was consistency, and really talking about having a national set of standards and some key protocols that are adhered to by everyone across the church in Australia. So reducing the sort of duplication and variation of some critical issues. And so one example of that might be how we manage complaints, and making sure that complaints are handled in the same way, no matter which part of the church you engage with or which part of the church you want to make a complaint about in the future. And his last element was compassion. So I will read Archbishop Coleridge's words. So he talked about to address all of the issues in their complexity and their intense practicality and their urgency, but to address them with the sense that the child or the vulnerable person must take priority, and that all of these issues must be seen through their eyes. That is compassion in this context. So really keeping at the heart of everything that we do at CPSL, in the front of our mind, children and young people and vulnerable people who are engaging with the church. That's why we exist, and that's who we're here to protect. So the changing culture really will mean in some places that dioceses and congregations might start to do things a little bit differently. There's already some examples of that are on the slide. So in some dioceses, people are sort of pooling their resources, so across education, maybe the Catholic care or the centre care and the parishes, and they're working together on the same policies, the same training, and sharing lots of information. In other places, that's not happening. That's not a bad thing. It's just that there are different ways to approach it. In other groups, where perhaps this has certainly come to my attention in some of the religious congregations, so with the sisters and brothers, where they might have delegated their ministry now into an incorporated body. Maybe there's an agency. The Good Samaritan sisters might have handed over some of their work, or the Sisters of St. Joseph or others. So they're talking to me about actually they need to understand a bit more and have better communication with those agencies so they understand what's happening and that they can be accountable for it. And then in some places, like in a diocese, for example, in a geographic location, some on the line might have experienced that actually there's better collaboration than there had been in the past around this issue. So the diocese working together with the congregations, together with the local St. Vincent de Paul, maybe the local Catholic hospital, and actually collaborating and sharing information and training. So there is lots of practical things happening that is contributing to changing culture. So I'll just spend a few minutes talking about the Royal Commission specifically, and then the actual standards that we're talking about at CPSL. So the final report of the Royal Commission, which was published in December last year, had over 180 recommendations, and that was on top of previous reports that they'd published throughout the 5 years of the Commission, where they'd made other recommendations about things like the criminal justice system, and also national working with children checks and other screening processes. 37 of those 180 recommendations apply directly to the work of Catholic Professional Standards, and I'll talk about some of those in a minute. And then another 45 are things that we're keeping our eye on. They don't necessarily directly relate to the work that we're doing right now, but they will have an impact potentially down the track. And some of those are things that are recommendations that have been made to government, for example. And I'll talk about those in a moment as well. But let me start by talking about the 10 standards. So the Royal Commission did a major piece of work during its 5 years, an international piece of research, quite detailed and evidence-based about what does contribute to excuse me, keeping institutions safe for children. So they looked internationally, they had international researchers contribute. And out of that research, they came up with these 10 standards. So makes sense for us at Catholic Professional Standards to take on those same 10 standards, but contextualise them for application to the life of the Church. So I'll run through the 10 standards. The first one is all about leadership, governance and culture, and making sure that leaders, whether they be the bishop or whether they be those who are on the line who are leading youth ministry, or whether they're the CEO of a Catholic care or centre care, that leaders and their governance and culture is very much has child safety at its forefront. Second standard is around children participating and having a voice, and I don't think it's any mistake that that comes a very close second in terms of the standards, and that voice can be heard by the leaders. Again, quite often some of the failings in the past were that the children's voices weren't heard directly by leaders. Third one, that families and communities are informed and involved. So making sure that families and the broader community understand how to make a complaint. They understand what our leaders' position is on child safety. They understand what the policy is and what the expectations for behaviour are. The fourth one, equity is promoted and diversity respected. This is everything from cultural diversity in terms of having a particular focus on vulnerabilities of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children, those from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. But also the Royal Commission highlighted again, for example, children with a disability are 10 times more likely to be abused in an institution than those without a disability. So a particular focus for us as well will be looking at how do we support and protect children and young people involved in our ministries who have a disability. Two of the standards, Standard 5 and Standard 7, relate to people. So that's the people working or representing the institution or the church. So the first, Standard 5, really talks about how do those people come to us? So what are our recruitment processes? How do we screen our paid staff, but also our volunteers and our clergy and religious? So every person who works or ministers on behalf of the church, are they the right people and are they supported to do their job? Do they understand their responsibilities to safeguard children? Standard 6 is around processes to respond to complaints. So we make sure that those processes are child-focused and friendly. And then Standard 7, as I mentioned before, is around staff again, not just paid staff, but everybody, volunteers, clergy, religious, but everybody has the knowledge and skills and awareness to maintain a child-safe environment, and that training and knowledge is continuously refreshed, that we don't just do it once and then say, okay, we're good, we're safe now. Standard 8 is around our environments, both physical and online. So are our buildings the safest they can be. When we take young people away on a camp, have we thought about the physical environment, but also the online environment, what's happening online for our young people in our institutions. And the 9th and 10th ones are really about the systems that we put in place. So Standard 9 is about making sure, as it was with the earlier one about training, that we don't just as a church sit back in a few years and say, well, that's it, we've all passed an audit, we're safe, but that this is a constant process of review and improvement. And the last one is that we make sure that our policies and procedures are very clear. So let me run through quickly what the Royal Commission then had to say quite specifically about church behaviour in a few of those standards. So governance and leadership, particularly, they have made some recommendations about reviewing governance across the church. So, and that's sort of at all levels. So that's from, again, as I said, what's the oversight of the Catholic care in your diocese, right through to how does the bishop get advice and what's the governance of the whole diocese, down to the parish level. Does every parish have a pastoral council? And even yourselves, how is youth ministry supported and governed? Catholic Professional Standards won't be doing that review, and we'll wait and see if the bishops and religious accept that as a recommendation, but I think they probably will. So there'll be a piece of work coming out about looking at our governance structures across the church. The other one of note here is the last dot point there, which is the Royal Commission also made a note not just about officials within the church, if you like, or employees and volunteers, but also the fact that our faith communities also have people in them who may not be are members of the community who've also had offences against them. And certainly this is an issue for families going through family violence, for example, when families break up and there might be intervention orders and things, but both parties still want to be connected to their parish. So what systems do we put in place to support our parishioners as well, or our members of the broader faith community? So we'll be looking at some support to help parishes do that. Standard 2 and 3, so there were some particular recommendations about making sure that the prevention message gets out to children and young people. How do they protect themselves, and what does safe relationships look like? So how we do that in the context of children who might attend liturgy on the weekend, or young people who are attending youth camps and youth groups. We'd be keen to engage with you guys on this webinar and others in your network about some of that, how we could do that appropriately, or how we can support you to do that appropriately, I should say. And again, there's recommendations there about making sure families and the broader community know what we're doing, so we be more open and transparent. There's quite a few specific recommendations about recruitment and screening, including for particular areas like clergy and religious who are coming to Australia from overseas. And there's been identified major gaps in their knowledge and understanding. So work with those groups specifically about how we can support them and help them understand better the Australian context. Complaint handling, so there's again some specific under Standard 6, including better clarity around what happens if there is an allegation in the future against, say for example, a priest. Then what are the processes for him standing aside and making sure that children and vulnerable people are safe if there's a risk, so doing better risk assessments and putting processes in place. In terms of knowledge, people's knowledge, there are some specific recommendations again about how we educate people around things like, for example, a code of conduct. I know myself in my background, having worked in a diocese, I didn't realise the diocese actually had a code of conduct. I only thought Catholic Care did. So there are sort of gaps in our knowledge of helping people understand what their responsibilities are. The other big one in there is providing better support and supervision for priests and religious as they go about their ministry. Particularly relevant, I see there's people on the line from Wilcannia Forbes. So when you're talking about remote and regional dioceses where there might be a parish that's, well, in Darwin, 1,000 kilometres to the next parish. How do you actually support a priest who's really quite isolated? So we really need to get creative about how we can do some of these things better. Environments, there's a key recommendation in there around reconciliation happening, particularly for children, being in open, but also with another adult in eyesight, not in earshot, obviously, but in eyesight. So looking at how we can increase some of the visibility around that. In terms of the things I mentioned before that we have a watching brief on, there's a few things there. I've mentioned a couple already, but one of them also is there were probably about a dozen recommendations that would have an impact on canon law, recommendations for changing some of the definitions of crimes in canon law. So we'll keep a watching brief on what happens there and what the bishops recommend to the Holy See. And there's also a recommendation about actually the Australian Church taking over some of that discipline process rather than it having to wait and go through the Holy See. That's a major issue for a lot of church authorities outside of Rome. Speaking to my colleagues from Ireland and the US and others, it can take a very long time, even when there is something that has been found to be an issue. In canon law, it can take a very long time for the Holy See to review those cases. So we really want to, the Royal Commission's recommendation really was about the Australian Church taking over some control of that themselves. So where are we up to and what are we doing? So we have these standards and we're doing some work on drafting them and making them work or relevant and quite practical to all sort of contexts of church at the moment. And in the next couple of months, they'll be published. So I'd really encourage those on the webinar and in your networks and in your diocese and wider networks to encourage people to keep an eye out for that and provide feedback to us. Then we'll also come out and do some workshops. So we'll have some discussions with people as well. But the biggest opportunity will be for people to put their direct feedback to us. And then before, probably around the middle of the year, we'll be testing our standards and the audits in a couple of dioceses, and a couple of congregations before, by the end of the year, actually doing our first audits and publishing some reports. So it'll be a very busy year, but very hopefully rewarding. So I thought I might pose some questions to you in getting close to wrapping up because I've probably gone over my time again. So how can you guys be involved and support the work of Catholic Professional Standards? So definitely, as I said, have a look when the draft standards come out, have a look. Maybe I've been talking to Rachel, perhaps we'll do a couple of specific webinars as a way of getting some feedback from the Youth Ministry Network. And sort of continue a national conversation about what the standards mean. We're commissioning a children and youth survey. So one of the things that I am really keen on is, the best measure of my success in this role and our organisation will be hearing from children and young people directly, that they do feel safe in their connection to church, that they do understand what their sort of rights are and they know how to say something if something's not right. So I want to hear directly from children and young people their perceptions and experience of safety. So we'll be rolling that out later this year. So it'd be great if you can pass that around to your networks and people involved in your youth ministry areas to participate in that survey. But also have conversations locally, maybe some of the topics today. So what does changing culture mean from your perspective within church? What does the notion of, if you see something, you should say something, what does that actually practically look like for people on the ground? We also know through the Royal Commission and other research that child abuse, takes usually on average about 30 years for someone who's been abused to come forward and say something. And that's actually probably a little bit longer when it comes to faith-based organisations. So what would it look like if we could have a better conversation with children today to give them the confidence to speak up before something happens? And what information do young people need from us, from Catholic Professional Standards, to help them understand their rights and also understand what we're doing? So I'd be really keen to hear from groups around what would be useful for us to do to have a voice. We'll have a better website soon, and we've got a bit of a vision of having a space that's very child and young person friendly, so some input about what that looks like would be really helpful too. And I did a webinar earlier today for another group. I've already had 2 newsletter sign-ups, so here's a plug for our newsletter for you to stay in touch. If you just send us an email at that email address, we'll add you to our database for our newsletter, so you'll get information directly and you can pass it on. In terms of what our job is more broadly, once the standards are written, obviously we have a role in providing training and support and advice to everyone across the church about how to protect children and vulnerable people and how to meet the standards. We will oversee the audits and report the findings publicly, and we'll also look at some other data nationally that we'll continue to produce that the bishops have asked us to around complaint rates and things, again trying to make sure that the church is transparent and in its dealings with people who are not happy. And we'll also continue to provide more strategic sort of policy advice about how the leaders of the church can continue to improve. And that's it. I've probably gone over time again. I'm sorry, Rachel. Contact details are there if you'd like to get in touch. Feel free. And yeah, thanks very much. I look forward to your chats and questions.
You put your questions in whichever way it's going in that Q&A box. Pop them in as we're going. So I'm going to get Sheree to come back and start answering some of those questions, but make the most of her while you've got her here and continue to pop your questions in whilst you have the chance. Thanks, Sheree.
All right. Thanks, Rachel. Thanks, everyone. There were some great questions and excellent takeaways too. So you were all listening very well. So I might start. There was a question, it disappeared. So I think that was because we could probably only put one in at a time. But someone raised a question about overseas priests and how we help support them, or what we do really. So there's a couple of things I'd say to that question. One is that, as I mentioned, they will be a particular focus of some of our work, and we're not the only country that. So when I talk to my colleagues internationally in the UK, the US, other parts of Europe and Ireland, there's a very similar issue there. You know, the issue of protecting children, if you like, in the way that we conceptualize it in what you would, I don't like the West, you know, the Western world analogy, but in those countries, our perception and understanding of child development, it's changed ourselves over the last 50 years, but it is radically different to some of those other countries where some of those overseas clergy may be coming from. So there's sort of some international work happening in the church around how we help priests and clergy coming from overseas enculturate better, understand before they come the context they're coming to quite often. But also, I think it's also incumbent on each of us. In the last webinar, a similar question was posed, and my answer was, if you know a priest or a religious who's from overseas, start the conversation with them about this. Help them understand the context from young people's perspective, and from the perspective of, you know, children's rights, and what we should do about that. So I think, if we start the conversation ourselves and take responsibility for that, that'll help. But we will also be looking at some structural ways of actually sort of giving overseas clergy more of an understanding of what they're coming to before they come and what the expectations are. And those expectations are the same on them as they are on anyone else. There was also a question, which I think disappeared as well, about cultural change with older members in a community or with people who say it's all too much paperwork, I can't do it. There's a couple of points to my answer around that. One is, I would say that the paperwork should be the least of the effort. Research also suggests that things, even though it's important that we should have things in place like working with children checks and police checks, we also know that the majority of serious offenders don't get prosecuted. What I said before about, takes on average 30 years for a child who's been sexually abused to speak up. Quite often by the time they speak up, their abuser might already be dead, or so it's very important. The screening's important, but it is the least effective. Actually, the most effective measure to stop, to protect children and protect vulnerable people is the notion of the open conversation. And the policies and procedures and mechanisms that allow people to speak up when they see something that isn't right. And I think, again, what the Royal Commission has taught us and what so many case studies, not just of the church, but of other organisations showed, is that often was also part of the problem. One of the case studies, case study 2, it's not a Catholic case study, it's a case study of the YMCA in New South Wales. The offender is still in jail. He's a contemporary of mine, so not that I know him, but he's my age. So he's not some mythical, dirty old man that people look to. He was a young man when he committed his offences. He also committed them in an organisation that had a lot of policies, and they had police checks, and they had working with children checks. But what they talked about in the Royal Commission themselves, this is the YMCA, was that they didn't have a culture that allowed people to sort of say something when their gut feeling was that things weren't right with this fellow, and that he was breaching some of their policies just really, really slightly. But every time he breached a policy, he was getting closer to being able to access children and abuse them. So it's a really tough question, and it's not going to change overnight. But I think we have to be all champions of that change and just continue to have the conversations about what makes children safer. Okay, now I'm going to read some of the other questions. How do we help? Oh, the question of fatigue, priests being fatigued, youth ministry being fatigued. I think it's a tough question, but I think my answer probably, and my inspiration really to that, is to think about the survivors. So they haven't been able to afford to be fatigued, and in fact their resilience is what brought the Royal Commission about in the first place, and brought all of Australia to account really for the appalling failings of the past. So whilst, yes, it might be hard, and, quite often I'm part of conversations where people are saying we have to recover the reputation of the church, and we're sick of being bashed, and, there's even some themes today about, campaigns to do away with the church. I'm not sure any of those are going to come off, and I get that people are fatigued. But I think my inspiration, as I said, is always to think about the victims. And if we are fatigued, then we'll end up putting children today at risk, and that's just not on. So that's perhaps not a practical answer, but I think it's what we should keep in our minds. And the last question that I can see are the recommendations of the Royal Commission regarding consultation with the Holy See. Are these in line or similar to those coming from countries that have also been through similar? So no, very, very similar. So I've had lots of conversations with my counterparts in Ireland, with some people in a couple of the universities in Rome who are very versed internationally, and with colleagues in the US principally. And very, very similar themes around the governance and the relationship between the local church and the Holy See. I think that's about it. I can't see any other questions. Oh no, wait, one more's come in. As Sheree was discussing the 10 standards, she bunched several standards together. Might this be something that CPSL is considering? Oh, no, sorry, that was me being efficient with my slides. So there will be the 10 standards. Some of I suppose the way to think about it is that what we'll try and help people do is see where there might be an approach, maybe doing some training, for example, and giving information to people that might actually demonstrate that you're addressing a couple of elements of the standards. So we'll certainly help people be able to refine their approach and their responses. Is there going to be a national working with children's check? That's another question. So there isn't at this stage. There was a strong recommendation from the Royal Commission that was published actually in 2015 that recommended nationalising the working with children, working with vulnerable people check system because that is governed at a state level. And even the states that have those sorts of checks, their thresholds and what they look for is different. So the Royal Commission did recommend very strongly a national approach, but the state and territory and national governments haven't committed to that yet. The most action I've seen at the moment was the federal government committed in their last budget in November, I think it was, last year, so the mid-year economic forecast or whatever they put out at the end of the year, that they were committing some money to a database that would sort of hold nationally the people who were not able to get their check. So if someone had failed a working with children check for a range of reasons, that would go into the national database, and so other states could look at that, but that isn't going to be a national check. So we'll continue to advocate for that because we know that the current system is not the best we could have. There's also a question about will there be a national apology? So the Prime Minister announced last week that he's putting together a working group to advise him on the development of a national apology from government. But I'm not aware whether there's been any conversation amongst church leaders about making an apology nationally. I think, though, I might try and follow that up and see if I can find out what might be happening about that. And then the last question, I think, what are the most important recommendations that we in youth ministry should be reading or looking into from the Royal Commission? That's a very interesting question. Out of those 180, I think it probably is the ones, so the standards, obviously, I would say, I'm a bit biased. So volume 6 of the Royal Commission would be a good one for everyone to have a look at. That is the volume that talks about what are the features and factors of child-safe organisations, which really is what the standards are trying to get to. But volume 6 gives some really good practical examples of how you can make sure that your organisation is as safe as possible. So probably volume 6. Depends how interested you are in things like canon law, which prior to coming into this job I had no interest in, but I'm learning very quickly. Yeah, I think volume 6. That might be it then.
Great, thank you